In 1999, 7 men controlled half of Russia's wealth. Within 5 years, most of them had knelt or fallen. Russia had been broken. A land ruled not by politicians, but by oligarchs. They had looted industries, bought influence, and pulled the strings of a fragile democracy like puppet masters behind a cracked stage. And when Boris Yeltsin's regime collapsed under its own corruption, these billionaires made a fateful choice. They lifted a little-known ex-KGB officer named Vladimir Putin into power, believing he would protect them, serve them, owe them. They were wrong. Putin hadn't climbed onto their shoulders. He had climbed over them. In just a few ruthless years, the kingmakers found themselves stripped of their kingdoms, exiled, imprisoned, or forced into submission. The man they thought was their pawn had become the architect of a new Russia. A Russia where loyalty wasn't optional, and betrayal came at a cost written in blood and exile. This is the story of how the billionaires built a president, and how that president built an empire without them. To understand Putin's rise and his clash with the billionaires, we must go back to the chaotic birth of Russia's oligarchs. It began in the early 1990s amid the rubble of the Soviet Union. Communism had collapsed, and Russia's new leaders rushed to transform a state-run economy into a capitalist one overnight. Factories ground to a halt. Hyperinflation devoured savings. Law and order crumbled. Contract killers carried out hits in broad daylight. Amid this turmoil, a daring experiment unfolded: mass privatization. The idea was to give every Russian a share of the nation's wealth through vouchers. But in practice, unscrupulous men in suits, a new class of opportunists, were the ones who won big. Boris Berezovsky, a former mathematician, made his first millions by hustling cars and computers, then elbowed his way into oil and media. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, a savvy young banker, snapped up old state oil fields for kopecks on the ruble. Roman Abramovich, an orphan from Siberia, traded anything he could: rubber ducks, gasoline, quietly amassing a fortune and becoming Berezovsky's protege. These men and a handful of others sensed an opportunity. The state's treasures were up for grabs, and they would stop at nothing to seize them. By 1995, President Yeltsin's government was nearly bankrupt and desperate. With an election looming and communists threatening a comeback, Yeltsin's team, led by economist Anatoly Shabai, struck a devil's bargain known as loans for shares. The scheme was simple and scandalous. A few wealthy financiers would lend the government money in exchange for temporary ownership of prime state assets. When, predictably, the state couldn't repay, those assets became theirs permanently. 12 of Russia's most valuable companies, oil fields, metals factories, telecoms, were auctioned off in late 1995. It was a charade. The winners had been chosen in advance. They paid absurdly low prices, almost literally a steal. For example, Berezovsky and Abramovich acquired the giant oil company Sibneft for around $200 million. Just years later, that stake would be worth dozens of times more. In 2005, Abramovich sold it back to the state for a staggering $13 billion. The payoff was beyond imagination, a fortune made in exchange for helping Yeltsin cling to power. The 1996 presidential election became the oligarchs' proving ground. Yeltsin was polling in the single digits, a political corpse without their help. So the oligarchs poured in millions of dollars to resuscitate him. They hired top Western spin doctors, blanketed TV with pro-Yeltsin propaganda, and even used their banks to funnel state funds into Yeltsin's campaign war chest. Two oligarchs in particular, Berezovsky and Vladimir Gusinsky, controlled 2 of the 3 major TV networks, and they pulled out all the stops. The strategy worked. Yeltsin miraculously won re-election in 1996, defeating the communist comeback. In the afterglow of victory, Berezovsky brazenly bragged that he and 6 other oligarchs controlled half of Russia's economy. That claim was likely exaggerated, but it captured the truth. A new elite class of billionaire kingmakers had emerged. They didn't build their empires by innovation or hard work for the public good, but through backroom deals, corruption, and the plunder of Russia's raw materials. As one chronicler put it, ordinary Russians saw ostentatious wealth flaunted against a backdrop of national poverty. Resentment simmered. It was as if the soul of the nation had been sold, and Vladimir Putin took notice. By 1999, Yeltsin's time was running out. The oligarchs, fearful of an uncertain future, searched for a successor who would guarantee their safety and wealth. In stepped Berezovsky, proposing a man he knew from years before. He lobbied Yeltsin to appoint Vladimir Putin as prime minister in August 1999, calculating that Putin would remain beholden to those who elevated him. "It was the biggest mistake of my life," Berezovsky would later admit of bringing Putin to power. But at the time, it seemed like a masterstroke. The trap was set. The oligarchs believed Putin would be their puppet, a front man to preserve their empire. They could not have been more wrong. Vladimir Putin had his own plan, one that would soon turn the hunters into prey. In July 2000, just months after being elected president, Vladimir Putin convened Russia's richest businessmen. The atmosphere is icy. These tycoons, the Berezovskys, the Abramoviches, the Potanins, the Gushinskys, had grown used to calling the shots under Yeltsin. But Putin is about to flip the script. He looks them in the eye and lays out a blunt deal. Stay out of politics and you can keep your empires. Defy me and you'll lose everything. It was an ultimatum, a new social contract between the Kremlin and its elite. The oligarchs nod and smile thinly, but behind their eyes is shock. This was not Yeltsin's feeble handshakes. This was a gauntlet thrown down by a man who meant every word. Most will submit, but a few test Putin's resolve and pay dearly. Vladimir Gushinsky, owner of Russia's most independent TV network, NTV, had allowed critical coverage of Putin's war in Chechnya. He is the first target. In June 2000, masked officers arrest Gushinsky on fraud charges. Within weeks, he's pressured into exiling himself and selling NTV to the state-controlled gas giant Gazprom for a pittance. The message is clear. Next in line is Boris Berezovsky, the very man who helped install Putin. At first, Berezovsky is in the inner circle, even a member of parliament. But by autumn 2000, he grows uneasy. He publicly criticizes Putin's moves to centralize power. In a bold gamble, Berezovsky refuses to surrender his stake in ORT, Russia's largest TV channel, which the Kremlin is eyeing for control. It is a fatal defiance. The Kremlin swiftly pushes him out. Facing imminent prosecution, Berezovsky flees to London in late 2000. He will never set foot in Russia again. Berezovsky had miscalculated Putin catastrophically. He thought Putin would be his puppet, but Putin had his own vision. A darker, less democratic Russia with Putin unequivocally in charge, an associate observed. Putin swiftly seized Berezovsky's prized ORT channel and turned it into a loyalist mouthpiece. The two men's feud became legendary and would ultimately follow Berezovsky to his grave. In exile, Berezovsky financed anti-Putin opposition and openly accused Putin of dark crimes, even claiming Putin orchestrated the radioactive poisoning of his friend Alexander Litvinenko in London in 2006. But from afar, Berezovsky was increasingly a spent force, his power extinguished by the very monster he'd helped create. While some oligarchs fell out with Putin, others quickly made peace with the new order. Roman Abramovich, Berezovsky's one-time protege, read the writing on the wall. Taciturn and discreet, Abramovich cozied up to Putin and even served as governor of a remote Siberian region, a show of loyalty and service. When Putin hinted that certain assets were better returned to state hands, Abramovich complied, later selling his giant Sibneft oil company back to the government for billions. His reward? He kept his fortune and his freedom, becoming one of the few 1990s oligarchs to thrive under Putin's reign. But the clearest and most dramatic showdown came with Mikhail Khodorkovsky, then Russia's richest man and head of Yukos Oil. Khodorkovsky was an oligarch of a different breed. He spoke of transparency, met with Western investors, and even funded opposition politicians, a direct challenge to Putin's unwritten rules. One morning in 2003, Khodorkovsky's jet was halted on a Siberian tarmac. Masked agents stormed aboard with assault rifles and arrested him for fraud and tax evasion. The image shocked the world. A billionaire in handcuffs dragged to prison. The trial was a showpiece of Putin's power. Khodorkovsky sat in a cage each day as prosecutors accused him of massive theft. In 2005, he was convicted and sent to a remote Siberian prison camp. His oil empire, Yukos, was carved up, its prime assets absorbed by the state oil company Rosneft at bargain prices. To many, it was retribution masquerading as law. Putin had made an example of the richest dissenter. No one was untouchable. If you challenged the Kremlin, you lost not just your company, but your freedom. By the mid-2000s, a grim pattern had emerged. Backroom deals turned into backstabbing. Some oligarchs scrambled to show fealty. Others who resisted fled or were imprisoned. Power had shifted. No longer did the billionaires control the Kremlin. The Kremlin now controlled them. Fear permeated the elite. In private, oligarchs swapped tales of intimidation. In public, they toe the line. One oligarch is heard murmuring, "We created Putin, and he's destroying us." Ambition, greed, betrayal. The grand drama of Russia's wealthy elite was in full swing, and Vladimir Putin held the director's chair, determined to tighten his grip even further. With the defiant oligarchs neutralized or tamed, Putin tightened his grip on Russia's elite. He reversed pieces of the 1990s privatization, especially in strategic sectors. Through pressure and persuasion, key oil, gas, and media assets returned to state hands or to the custody of Putin's most trusted allies. The message to the public: the wealth stolen in the wild 90s is being returned to the motherland. The message to the elite: play by Putin's rules or perish. Popular sentiment was on Putin's side. After years of oligarch excess, many Russians cheered to see these powerful men humbled. Putin had promised during his campaign to eliminate the oligarchs as a class. He didn't eliminate them outright, but he tamed them, co-opted them, or replaced them. New billionaires emerged, Putin's men. They were often longtime friends or former KGB colleagues. Yuri Kovalchuk, the banker dubbed Putin's personal banker. Gennady Timchenko, his oil trading ally. The Rotenberg brothers, Putin's judo partners turned construction magnates. These loyalists prospered mightily, their wealth soaring in exchange for absolute fealty. Meanwhile, powerful figures from the security services, the Siloviki, also amassed fortunes, turning into a new breed of oligarch, sometimes called oligarchs, with Igor Sechin of Rosneft as their unofficial leader. In 2008, Putin performed a political sleight of hand, swapping the presidency with his protege Medvedev for 4 years to skirt term limits. Even during this interlude, it was clear Putin still called the shots. None of the oligarchs dared test Medvedev's relative liberalism by stepping out of line. When Putin returned as president in 2012 amid public protests, any remaining illusions of pluralism vanished. The Khodorkovsky saga reached a conclusion. After a decade behind bars and 2 convictions, the oil magnate was suddenly pardoned by Putin in 2013 and immediately exiled abroad, a move calculated to soften Putin's image ahead of the Sochi Olympics. Khodorkovsky emerged from prison a changed man, vowing to fight for democracy from exile, but his company was long gone and his billions scattered. It was the final punctuation mark on the era of the 1990s oligarchs. They would never again threaten the throne. Perhaps the most telling display of Putin's dominance came in a small factory town called Pikalevo. The local industry had collapsed, owed wages were unpaid, and the townsfolk were desperate, all because an oligarch, Oleg Deripaska, had idled his cement plant during an economic downturn. Putin saw an opportunity. He flew in to personally confront Deripaska, once Russia's richest man. In front of TV cameras, Putin excoriated the assembled owners, comparing their neglect of the people to the behavior of cockroaches. He tossed a pen across the table and ordered a cowering Deripaska to come here and sign a deal to restart the factory. Deripaska, head bowed, scribbled his name. As the oligarch retreated, Putin delivered a final humiliating blow. "And now, give me back my pen," he snapped. The message was beamed to millions on state TV. Even the mightiest tycoon must bend to the will of Putin. This public dressing down was theater with a purpose. Putin cast himself as the champion of the common Russian against the predatory rich. And indeed, from that point, no oligarch ever dared openly challenge Putin again. Those who stayed in Russia became careful servants of the Kremlin's interests. Those who had fled, like Berezovsky and Gushinsky, watched from abroad as their influence dwindled and their assets in Russia were seized or redistributed. Boris Berezovsky remained in London, plotting and lamenting. Over the years, his fortune waned. He lost a major lawsuit against Abramovich in 2012 and was hit with enormous legal bills. Friends say he grew despondent, haunted by his mistake of elevating Putin. In March 2013, Berezovsky was found dead on the floor of his UK mansion, a scarf around his neck. Officially ruled a suicide, his death remains shrouded in mystery and suspicion, fitting for a man whose life played out like a spy novel. Thus ended the life of the once powerful oligarch who had made and lost a president. With opponents vanquished and loyalists enriched, Putin's hold on Russia's wealthy elite was absolute. The oligarchs as a class survived. Indeed, many still grew fabulously rich, but only at the pleasure of Putin. They had traded political power for personal safety. It was a pact sealed by fear. A symbiosis emerged. The oligarchs' wealth bolstered Putin's Russia internationally, and Putin's regime bolstered the oligarchs' fortunes. A bit like a medieval king and his vassals exchanging tribute for protection. Even as they lived under Putin's shadow, Russia's billionaires reveled in wealth and opulence that boggled the mind. Far from the drab Soviet communal apartments of their youth, they now inhabited a stratosphere of luxury accessible only to sultans and kings. It was as if, having gambled with destiny and won, they were determined to live life on a cinematic scale. Take Roman Abramovich, for example. At one point the wealthiest of Putin-era oligarchs, Abramovich became known worldwide as the owner of London's Chelsea Football Club. But it was his toys that truly symbolized the oligarchic lifestyle. His super yacht Eclipse cost an estimated $600 to $700 million to build, complete with its own nightclub, submarine, and laser anti-paparazzi system. A floating palace that once literally eclipsed all other private yachts in size. He owned a second mega yacht, private jets, and estates worth hundreds of millions. In the early 2000s, oligarch yachts became a common sight from Saint-Tropez to Sambar, floating bastions of extravagance where champagne flowed and deals were whispered on sun-drenched decks. The oligarchs partied as if each night were their last. In the French ski resort of Courchevel, ultra-rich Russians became notorious for epic parties. Mikhail, a metals tycoon and playboy, once flew in dozens of young models for a New Year's extravaganza, an event so conspicuous that French police raided it on suspicion of prostitution, landing Prokhorov in a cell and scandalizing Europe. Though charges were dropped, the legend of the oligarch's dizzying nightlife only grew. They thought nothing of dropping $100 million on a whim, be it on diamonds for a girlfriend or a single painting at a Christie's auction. One Russian billionaire paid a record sum for a villa in Cap Ferrat. Another bought an entire Greek island. Their wives and daughters became fixtures in couture fashion shows and charity balls, bedecked in jewels that rivaled royal collections. Nowhere was the oligarch's influence more visible than London, nicknamed Londongrad for the influx of Russian money. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, billions of dollars poured into London's real estate, banks, and private schools, courtesy of Russia's mega-wealthy. Stately mansions in Kensington and Highgate were snapped up by the likes of Alisher Usmanov, metals and tech magnate, Len Blavatnik, oil and media investor, and Roman Abramovich himself. Exclusive neighborhoods turned into virtual ghost towns of absentee Russian owners, glitzy investments, and status symbols. The oligarchs lived global lifestyles, summers in the Côte d'Azur, winters in Courchevel or Aspen, shopping sprees in Dubai, art buying in New York. They rubbed shoulders with Hollywood celebrities, princes, and politicians. Many obtained dual nationalities or investor visas in Western countries. They cultivated an image of cosmopolitan tycoons, even as their fortunes remained tethered to the authoritarian system back home. The luxury often strayed into the outrageous. An investigative video by opposition figure Alexei Navalny in 2021 unveiled what was alleged to be Putin's palace, a secret $1.3 billion compound on the Black Sea. This estate, ostensibly owned through a web of oligarch proxies, featured absurd indulgences: a private theater, a casino with slot machines, a pole-dancing hookah lounge, a subterranean ice palace hockey rink, vineyards, and even an underground tunnel to the beach. The decor dripped with opulence down to the scandalous detail of 850 gold-plated toilet brushes and custom velvet furniture. While Putin publicly distanced himself from this palace, it became a symbol, a manifestation of how the oligarch system not only enriched the billionaires, but allegedly provided limitless luxury to Putin himself through loyal cutouts. For these elites, money was a tool to conquer the world's playgrounds. If a private island was on the market, they'd buy it. If an English Premier League football club was up for sale, why not? By 2003, Abramovich's purchase of Chelsea FC for roughly $3 billion transformed him into a household name in Britain, ushering in an era of Russian money in European sports. Oligarchs sponsored prestigious art galleries, donated to universities and endowed charities, often to launder their reputations as much as their money. The international influence of this jet set was significant. They hired top lobbyists and PR firms, gained audiences with presidents and prime ministers, and sometimes even acted as informal envoys for the Kremlin's interests. Yet behind the gleaming facade of yachts and chateaus, there was always an undercurrent of paranoia. These men knew how fickle favor could be. A whispered word from the Kremlin could freeze assets or end careers. So even as they reveled in riches, many oligarchs kept an emergency bag packed. Private jets on standby, contingency plans to flee at a moment's notice. They lived like kings, but also like marked men, indulging in pleasures that ordinary people could scarcely imagine, all the while looking over their shoulders. The oligarchs' charmed global life would not remain unchallenged. Over time, geopolitical earthquakes sent shockwaves through their fortunes. Putin's Russia became more confrontational on the world stage, and the West, once a happy playground for oligarch wealth, turned into a battleground of economic sanctions. In 2014, Russia's annexation of Crimea prompted the United States and Europe to impose the first broad sanctions on Putin's inner circle. Suddenly, names like Gennady Timchenko, the oil trader friend, and the Rottenberg brothers, construction tycoons, appeared on blacklists. Bank accounts were frozen, villas in Italy sat empty under government seal, private jets were denied landing rights. For the first time, being a Kremlin-linked billionaire carried a cost in the West. Some oligarchs brushed it off, a small price for restoring Russian glory, one might have mused publicly. But inside boardrooms in Moscow, there was unease. Their business empires, reliant on global markets and finance, were suddenly vulnerable. When the U.S. Treasury sanctioned Oleg Deripaska in 2018, citing alleged malign activities and past ties to organized crime, the impact was seismic. Stocks of his aluminum empire crashed. Western banks halted dealings. The once high-flying oligarch had to cede control of his companies and plead for sanctions relief, effectively bowing to foreign demands to salvage his business. He bitterly quipped that the accusations were nonsense and that he'd done nothing to deserve it. But there was no denying it. The age of consequence had arrived for Russia's elite abroad. It was only a prelude to the maelstrom of 2022. When Putin launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the world reacted with unprecedented unity. This time, sanctions came down like a sledgehammer on virtually every oligarch of note. Within weeks, the UK, EU, US, and allies sanctioned dozens of Russian billionaires, including those who had long moved comfortably in Western circles. Roman Abramovich, Mikhail, Petr Avin, German Khan, Andrei Melnichenko, Igor Sechin, Alisher Usmanov. The list went on. Governments seized any asset they could find. Mega yachts were dramatically seized in ports from Hamburg to Fiji. In Fiji, a 106-meter yacht called Amadea, worth $300+ million and linked to oligarch Suleiman Karimov, was detained at the U.S.'s request. In Italy, police captured Scheherazade, a $700 million super yacht rumored to be used by Putin himself or his circle in a marina. Usmanov's Dilbar, the largest yacht by tonnage, was taken under custody by German authorities. Abramovich's two yachts, Eclipse and Solaris, fled to Turkey to avoid seizure. Private jets belonging to these tycoons raced to jurisdictions like Dubai or Moscow to escape being grounded by Western bans. The toll was immense. Within days of the 2022 war, Russian billionaires lost an estimated $95 billion in collective wealth as markets plunged and sanctions bit. But more painful than the paper losses were the personal indignities. Mikhail, a banking tycoon residing in London, found his credit cards frozen and had to beg UK authorities for living expenses, lamenting that he even had to start doing his own grocery shopping. Petr Oven, another London-based oligarch, said he wasn't sure if he could even pay his utility bills. These were men who used to command global empires, now reduced to negotiating allowances like common parolees, at least in foreign lands. Back in Moscow, Putin convened the oligarchs once again, just days after the invasion, reportedly in a gilded Kremlin hall. This time, it was not an ultimatum, but a grim reassurance come morning. Stand with Russia, weather the pain, and we will find ways to support you. In truth, however, many oligarchs had nowhere else to go. The bridges to the west were burning, perhaps already burned. Their yachts and foreign mansions were either seized or off limits, their foreign bank accounts locked. If they wished to keep what remained of their fortunes, they had little choice but to rally around Putin and hope for the best. A few dared to voice dissent in cautious tones. Oleg Deripaska posted on social media calling for peace and saying war was a mistake, but quickly toned down his remarks after Kremlin pushback. Mikhail called the war a tragedy and said violence must stop, but admitted he could do nothing to influence events. The most outspoken was Oleg Tinkov, a banking billionaire not quite in the inner oligarch circle. He blasted the invasion as insane, and within days, under pressure, was forced to sell his stake in his bank for kopecks on the dollar and fled Russia, claiming the regime threatened to nationalize his assets if he didn't comply. These episodes served as a stark reminder. Even at their weakest, Putin's wrath could reach anyone who stepped out of line. The comfortable world the oligarchs had known, where they could straddle east and west, profit from Russia's resources while enjoying Western stability, was crumbling. They were now pariahs in many countries. Their names were being removed from charity donor walls, their memberships in elite clubs suspended. They couldn't safely visit their own villas. For some, even their children at overseas universities faced visa issues. And yet, for all this pressure, the billionaires could not topple Putin, contrary to some Western hopes. They had built their fiefdoms under Putin's patronage and had no power base without him. If anything, the sanctions bonded them closer to the Kremlin. With their yachts and accounts frozen abroad, their vast wealth was effectively trapped in Russia or a few friendly territories. Putin essentially told them, "Your money is safer at home." In other words, the oligarchs now needed Putin more than ever. Their loyalty, once a choice, was now a matter of survival. Decades have passed since the Soviet Union's fall gave birth to Russia's wealthy elite. The saga of Putin and the billionaires is one of ambition and greed, fear and loyalty, betrayal, and perhaps a form of redemption. Not for all, but for a nation seeking its path. Now, in the mid-2020s, we look upon a Russia transformed by this uneasy alliance of power and money. Vladimir Putin's system changed Russia's elite forever. He took a fractious, arrogant oligarchy that had run roughshod over a fledgling democracy and brought it to heel under the state's authority, or more precisely, under his authority. In doing so, he created a new model, a hybrid of capitalism and feudalism. Oligarchs retain their wealth, often multiplying it, but forfeited independent political power. They became, in essence, vassals to a modern-day czar. For a time, this arrangement brought stability. The Russian economy recovered in the 2000s. Living standards rose for a while, and Putin's popularity soared on the back of both improved fortunes and nationalist pride. Many average Russians, who had despised the flashy oligarchs of the 90s, took a certain schadenfreude in seeing figures like Berezovsky humbled. Putin appeared to restore order and pride, reining in the unruly boyars of capitalism. Yet this system had a dark side. It stifled genuine entrepreneurship and political evolution. Ambition was channeled not into innovation or public good, but into currying favor with the Kremlin. Corruption remained endemic, merely centralized. And as Putin turned more authoritarian, the oligarchs became instruments of state policy, whether funding pet projects like extravagant Olympics or World Cups, acting as back channels in foreign deals, or supporting geopolitical aims. Some oligarch-linked companies even quietly aided defense industries. Wealth and state power merged in ways that made distinguishing private from public nearly impossible. Globally, the rise of Russia's elite had profound implications. Hundreds of billions of dollars flowed out of Russia, much of it finding a safe harbor in the West. This capital flight propped up luxury markets from Manhattan to Miami, from the Côte d'Azur to Dubai. But it also exported corruption. Western financial systems, lawyers, and lobbyists became enablers of oligarch wealth, turning a blind eye to its origins. In London, questions arose about undue political influence. Was Russian money seeping into the halls of Westminster via donations and golden visas? In smaller countries, Russian billionaires sometimes became power brokers, buying newspapers, influencing elections, or at least trying to. The Kremlin's reach extended subtly through these financial tentacles, even as governments often looked the other way until it was too late. As we reach today, one cannot help but ask, what is the endgame for Putin and his billionaires? History suggests that no reign is eternal. Putin's rule, built on this elite bargain, will one day end, whether by retirement, revolution, or natural causes. What then becomes of the oligarchs? Will they fracture into warring factions as in the 1990s? Will a new strongman co-opt them anew or cast them aside entirely? Perhaps some foresee the writing on the wall. In recent years, a few oligarchs quietly moved assets into trusts or signaled mild disapproval of Kremlin policies, hedging their bets. There is a poignant twist in Mikhail Khodorkovsky's journey. Once a symbol of oligarchic greed, he emerged from prison advocating for civil society and funding pro-democracy initiatives from exile. In a way, he found a form of redemption, using what remains of his wealth and voice to fight the very system that he helped prosper from, a system that later crushed him. In Khodorkovsky's transformation from richest oligarch to dissident lies an irony of this era, that some oligarchs eventually recognized the hollowness of the bargain they struck. As he and others have warned, a nation that trades freedom for stability may end up with neither. For the broader Russian populace, the oligarch chapter has been bittersweet. The 1990s brought poverty and embarrassment. The oligarchs gorged while the people starved. The Putin era curbed the worst excesses and restored sovereignty, but at the cost of entrenching a new class of untouchables and quashing political freedoms. Russia today is more assertive globally, yet internally, inequality runs deep. The gilded lives of the elite still a stark contrast to the struggles of ordinary citizens. The yachts and mansions, though sometimes hidden, remain, as do the private jets and offshore accounts. Sanctions and war have only reinforced the fortress mentality of this elite, bound together with Putin in adversity. In this high-stakes documentary thriller, we have witnessed the rise of a nobody to absolute power, the feeding frenzy of wealth in a collapsed empire, and the ensuing battle of wills between a ruler and his boyars. We've seen ambition turning allies into enemies, fear keeping compatriots in check, greed fueling breathtaking extravagance, paranoia seeping into every champagne toast, betrayals leading to exile or death, and faint glimmers of redemption in the unlikeliest of figures. The story of Putin and the billionaires is still being written. It's a story of a nation's soul at war with itself, The pull of Western-style freedom and wealth against the push of Russian autocracy and tradition. It leaves us with uneasy questions. Did Russia's elite ultimately save the country from 90s chaos, or doom it to a new kind of corruption? Are they patriots, opportunists, or prisoners of their own making? And when the inevitable change comes, will Russia finally break the cycle of rule by the rich and powerful? Or will the names and faces simply change again? One thing is certain, the fates of Vladimir Putin and his billionaires are inextricably linked. They rose together out of the ashes of an empire, and together they have shaped the world's largest country in their image, for better or for worse. Their story is a cautionary tale of power and wealth, a real-life Game of Thrones played not with dragons, but with oil fields, media empires, and mega-yachts. It is dramatic, immersive, and emotionally intense because it is, at its core, the story of modern Russia. A story still unfolding, as suspenseful and gripping as any thriller. In the end, the saga of Putin and the billionaires shows that in Russia, the line between servant and master, king and kingmaker, can shift in a heartbeat. And as history has shown time and again, those who ride the tiger of power may one day find themselves devoured by it. And there you have it, the tangled web of Putin's oligarchs, where wealth isn't just power, it's loyalty, leverage, and survival. These aren't just billionaires, they're chess pieces in a global game, one where the king never plays fair. But if you think this ends in Moscow, think again. In our first video, we exposed something even more shocking, how Donald Trump might not just admire Putin, but could actually be working for him. So if you want to follow the money, the secrets, and the smoke signals stretching from the Kremlin straight into the West Wing, do check out this video. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, and remember, it's never just politics, it's always power.